All right, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Amali and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Osita Nwanevu and Alex Shepard with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Osita's debut book, The Right of the People. Before we get officially started, however, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First up, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Osita will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. We also have free copies of the latest issue of the New York Review of Books, which features Osita in it, so please make sure to grab one of those as well. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of The Right of the People online using the link in the live stream description. Okay, now let's get into this. It's pretty clear at this point in time that American democracy is failing. In The Right of the People, Osita argues that the steep decline is the path we've been on since the beginning, and to reverse, or at least halt it, there needs to be a rebuilding of this democratic system, from its politics to its economics and beyond. There's so much to discuss within these pages, so let me introduce you all to tonight's wonderful guests. Osita Nwanevu is a contributing editor at The New Republic and a columnist at The Guardian, writing about American politics and culture. He lives in Baltimore, Maryland. As I mentioned earlier, Alex Shepard joins Osita in conversation tonight. Alex is senior editor of The New Republic, where he's covered politics and culture since 2015. That's all from me. Please join me in giving Osita and Alex a very warm welcome.
Hello.
Hi. Oh, can you hear me? That's good.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm bad at this. I was wondering, so one of the things that jumped out to me as I was reading this book is I realized something that I had not thought about at all, even as I had been writing about my own frustrations with the Democratic Party and the failure of the sort of narrative in the 2024 election that Donald Trump was this existential threat to the country. And as I read the book, I realized that you had discovered something that seemed deceptively simple, which was that when Democrats were talking about Trump as an existential threat to democracy, they never really defined what democracy was, which at first made me feel silly because I was like, it's right there the whole time, and then later I think it's just been kind of haunting me. But I was wondering, how you sort of picked up on this sort of idea, this sort of slippery definition of democracy that was being deployed not just by Democratic Party leaders, but also by elites, by academics. And I think the book itself exists as a sort of attempt to actually backfill that definition. When did you sort of start this project? Why did you start it? And what do you think democracy really means?
Sure. So I've been covering American politics for about 9, 10 years now, and I think that democracy has been at the core of everything I've covered from the beginning. Obviously, Trump comes in 2016 with an electoral college victory rather than the popular vote victory. Second time in 25 years that's happened. I remember being in second grade, the first time this happened, at least this century, and being incensed for reasons I didn't really understand as a second grader about the electoral college. But there's this kind of basic sense of unfairness that I perceived even then, and I guess I've carried with me every year since. But 2016 I think was a kind of major moment for me in sort of reckoning with, or having to reckon with, the fundamental character of our system. And even beyond that, as I covered the Democratic primary in 2020, I found myself having to say over and over and over again, well, yes, most Americans might want this on healthcare or on taxes or environmental policy and so on. But even if Democrats win this presidential election, even if they win control of Congress, this probably isn't going to happen for X, Y, and Z reasons. And I felt like I was having to, I guess, describe that over and over again without really explaining it, without really delving into whether that was sensible, whether that was just, whether the system was created in a way that matched our kind of moral and basic political intuitions. And I wanted a chance to write about that at length. Is the system actually democratic, and what does that fundamentally mean? And I didn't know that we'd have this election that we had when I started this book in 2021. But I think the reaction to it in the time since has really convinced me that it was worthwhile. I mean, to see Democrats and frankly even people on the left, who I think very sincerely over the course of the last 10 years fought and argued for expanding voting rights and fighting voter ID and fighting voter suppression and all of these things. You see some of those people, this is not representative, but you see some of those people, because Trump won a popular vote this time around, say, well, maybe people are just too stupid to deserve political rights. Maybe democracy isn't all it's cracked up to be. Maybe the American people are too, riddled with misinformation for this to make sense as a system. Seeing that made me feel really good about writing a book, defending democracy, sort of getting people back to basics and sort of in touch with their principles, so that this isn't just a fair weather thing. If democracy is just something that we defend and talk about and say is good when we're winning, it becomes very, very easy, I think, for authoritarians and people who are not Democrats, small d Democrats, to say, well, they don't have a real commitment to this thing anyway. Why not just abandon the whole edifice and the whole pretense that this is something that people like, and instead, caught into some form of authoritarian or other non-democratic rule. So yeah, I wanted the chance to make a defense of democracy that I thought would be also more compelling than the kind of rhetoric that we think we've heard for the last decade, and especially in the last year or so during the election, that democracy is about the ballot box and not having elections stolen, and those things are important too. But if that were sufficient enough of a message to get people caught into this idea and understand why it's important, we would have won the last election, and we didn't. So we need something more. We need something more robust. We need something that's really galvanizing, and that's what I hope the book provides. And I should define democracy, I guess, while we're here. Democracy is a system in which the governed govern. I have saved each and every one of you a lot of time delving into very dusty, very dry, very boring political theory, political science books. Ultimately, that's it. It's this idea that the people who are themselves governed by a system are the ones who are doing the governing in some sense. It's not a responsibility that's given over to some king, some class of oligarchs, some aristocrats. It's the people themselves that are doing it, or in Lincoln's formulation, government of, by, and for the people. That's the basic idea, and the first chapter of the book delves into how you can tell whether a system is democratic on those grounds.
Yeah, one of the things that kept jumping out to me is, especially since the election, but really since the inauguration, when I go out and talk to particularly keyed in Democratic loyalists, especially older people, but they're from across the board, you hear a lot of anger and resentment towards Trump voters, right? There's this idea, I think, that these people should be punished in some way, or that they deserve what's coming to them. You saw this especially after the big, beautiful bill was passed in early July. And, I think another thing that jumped out to me, speaking of those dry, dusty Democratic books, is that after Trump's election in 2016, there was a kind of brief cottage industry of just like everybody was pumping out these books, Democracy for Realists, Democracy for Farmers, Democracy for God knows what else. And I think that, you one really dive through the sort of, emergent democratic or democracy literature. But I think that you also look at a lot of writing that is essentially saying that, voters are stupid, right? Voters deserve this. It's not the system, right? It's the people that are involved in it. And I think that level of thinking doesn't just stop at the grassroots, right? You hear it from elected officials in various capacities, and particularly from staffers at times as well. And I think one of the things that I found most striking and hopeful about this book is the idea that if you have a real democracy, it does actually empower people, and it helps. And I think that it's a really humanistic book in a way that so much of one, I guess my question here is, why do you think so much of this sort of emergent democracy literature is some anti-humanist to some extent?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. That's the kind of empire of the academy, kind of invading everything. I think political science is very important. Economics important. I'm not one of the people on the left who will say that these things are fake. I think they're real. They provide us with a lot of insights, but they also, I think, often engage with politics in a way that is, I wouldn't say limited to the realm of abstraction, but it doesn't see people as people. And I think that has real interpretive consequences. So you'll read a lot in the political science literature, for instance, about ways to prevent political systems from cottoning to or succumbing to extremism. That there's something inherently good about fighting extremist politics, which I guess political scientists might define as, you have the DW nominate score, whatever. This is like, we're already getting way too nerdy. But you can put people's political views or sign of votes on the spectrum, and people who are on either ends, those are people who are extremes and they're out of touch with most Americans and blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, at a certain point in our history, in fact, within living memory, the idea of racial equality that we take for granted today was kind of an extreme opinion. The idea that women should vote was an extreme opinion. So to design a political system in which you are marginalizing views or discounting views or disempowering views simply because they are at the outskirts of public opinion doesn't really make sense. But political scientists say this kind of thing all the time. So I think that that's the kind of mentality that books like Democracy for Realists, come out of. This is a book that came out in 2016 before the election. Yes. I think quickly after the election happened, everybody turned to it as an explanation for what had happened. And it's a book that delves into things that I think are important, tribalism, the extent to which people, are not fully informed in their political decisions and so on. All these things I think are important to grapple with, and I do in the second chapter of the book, but the conclusion that you are brought to there and in other places in the literature that are similar, is that we shouldn't invest very much hope in democracy at all, that there are these kind of elemental aspects of people making collective decisions that we should always distrust, and they're always going to lead us kind of astray, which I don't think the historical record actually justifies. One of the points I make in the book is, look, when African Americans did not have the vote and when women did not have the vote, these are people who would have been, I think, on average, far less informed about politics, less knowledgeable about politics than the white men who had been given the ability to participate in politics for a very long time. And we brought them into the electorate kind of en masse, in a relatively short amount of time. And I think that's a kind of test case. We can say, it's a matter of, empiricism. Like, did America collapse? We had this massive influx of people who are not as well informed into the electorate. Were things worse off either for them or for the country as a whole? And I think the record shows actually it was not. We got stronger, wealthier, healthier, whatever, as a country, even after this. Which should tell us something. I think one of the things it should tell us is that people are more dynamic, and our system is more capable of absorbing all kinds of people in the electorate than I think we're given to assume. Even when we do make mistakes collectively, as I think we did in November, that shouldn't be cause for a kind of despair that I think is irrational given the context of American history. I would not trade the electorate of 2024 with the electorate of 1924, 1824. 100 years ago, there were literally millions of Americans who were in the Ku Klux Klan. This is not all-encompassing of all races on the American side. This is just members of the Ku Klux Klan in a much smaller country. Can I understand that history and have a kind of conniption that people voted for Donald Trump in November? No, I can't. We had this setback, and I think democracy, one of the unique things about it is that it gives us the capacity to learn from our mistakes. If we give over our power to some other authority, some other entity, we never develop ourselves. We never take chances and take risks and do new things and learn from those experiences, and in that process, become better people. I mean, democracy has this kind of promise of improving the public uniquely relative to other systems. And I think that's one of the things that's part of why we should protect and desire it.
I mean, I think, and also that kind of the faith in collective decision making that you display in this book and just now as well is sort of what you lay out. Many of the founders, it's why they were so skeptical of making America a true democracy. And another thing that I felt was very powerful in this book was the very long section you have sort of laying out the arguments both, at the formation of the country and then also particularly at the Constitutional Convention, sort of, one describing just how much dissension there was. You don't hear about this a lot, I think, in part because we've just decided that the country was sort of formed in this, pristine and perfect way 250 odd years ago, 240 odd years ago. And, but one of the things that I also found that jumped out at me that I thought was odd was that, I read a lot of books by people like Hugh Hewitt because I don't value my time. And you hear a lot about this in a stupid way. You hear about this stuff in those types of books, but in books from much smarter people, academics, people from the left, there's very rarely a discussion about the American founding in the same way. And I think what you've done in this, which I think is brilliant, is also lay out just how much dissension there was, right? That this was not the sort of perfect article.
No.
And I think one of the questions I had here is, why do you think there's so much resistance to talk about the founding on the left compared to on the right? And do you think that there is benefit for more scholarship or just conversation about what actually happened when this country was formed?
Yeah, I mean, one way to put it, or the way that I kind of see where the founding sits in American politics, is that I think that the right is wrong on just about all the specifics, but right about the fundamental character of the founding. Whereas I
a
think-
republic, not a democracy.
Yes, and I think liberals are, as is their wont, very right and accurate about a lot of specifics, but miss the kind of larger picture. The republic, not a democracy thing. Going back to college, I kind of didn't really understand the battle lines along this question. I mean, when you read about Rome and you read about the Italian maritime republics, it is very obvious to you that these are not representative democracies in any kind of meaningful sense. They are governments in which power is distributed in a certain way. There are checks and balances. There are rights and obligations that people owe to each other, but these are not representative democracies. And so to hear liberals say that, all a republic is a kind of representative government, it's just not, historically, it's not true. And I felt like I needed to say that in this book and sort of outline why that was the case. Now, I think the republic can be a democracy, and that's what I'm arguing for. But I think that the kind of standard response of conservatives on this question and how to think about the founding has been insufficient. I think it's led us to gloss over and kind of romanticize certain fundamental aspects of the system that are worthy of changing. I guess the condensed version of the founding is this. The American Revolution was a real war. We did not fight this thing with quill pens and parchment. It was a real conflict in which tens of thousands of people died. It was the deadliest war of any, except the American Civil War, by percentage of the population that ends up killed. And it destroys the American economy. We lose about 50% of gross national product per capita in the first 15 years of this country. So it's the worst economic depression until the Great Depression. Truly devastating conflict that upends colonial society, no longer colonial society, American society. And in response to this, a lot of people began turning to their state governments. You have a federal government under the Articles of Confederation that is genuinely terrible. This is one of the things that you were told in civics class or whatever at grade school. That is true. It was genuinely very stupid form of government. You needed unanimous or supermajorities to do anything of real consequence. You needed unanimous consent to amend the Basic Compact. You could ask the states nicely for things like requisitions that would fund the government's functions. They would just often not give them to you. But the really active governments at this time were the state governments. Pretty democratically accessible. People started going to them in the aftermath of the revolution, began asking for debt relief, tax relief. Can we pay our taxes and debts in goods or in installments? And could you perhaps print paper money, which would make it easier for us to discharge these debts and obligations? Most states end up acquiescing to this. Massachusetts is one of the states that is the most resistant. And so in late 1786, early 1787, there was an uprising that I think you probably also heard about maybe in US history called Shays' Rebellion that's eventually put down. But this horrifies the entire founding class. They think that discharging debts in these ways, printing paper money, undermines creditworthiness, undermines stability of private property, undermines the stability of contracts. And for this reason, they talked about amending the Articles of Confederation for some time. Those attempts have not really been successful. This crisis pushes them to adopt a new document, one in which they'd have a strong federal government, one that was capable of acting directly upon the American people, asking them also directly for things, one that would be sovereign over and above the states. This is one of the things Republicans get wrong. The idea that the founders loved state federalism is not true. They wanted to completely obliterate the states. Alexander Hamilton talks about getting rid of them entirely. Yeah. But they come to the convention with this sense that in the aftermath of the revolution, we'd seen an excess of democratic power being used for the purpose of basic economic populism. And they wanted to create a federal system in which that was no longer going to be possible. And that's where the institutions we have come from today. Obviously, there have been many, many important changes. We now have the direct election of senators. The Electoral College doesn't work in the way that the founders expected it to, and so on. Women can vote. African Americans vote. These are all great things. But the fundamental character of the system, some of its basic structural features, the Senate, the way the judiciary works, etc., these have kind of been established since the original founding and set in stone since the original founding. And I think that they are increasingly, as we are all maybe in this room hopefully aware, deranging our politics. I think that to the extent that people hoped that they'd be bulwarks against the rise of a demagogue like Donald Trump, they've actually brought him into power and helped him stay there. Not only did he win the Electoral College in 2016, but in the 2 impeachment attempts that he had in his first term, senators representing majorities of the country, I think more than 50% the first time, more than 60% the second time, voted to remove him from office. It didn't matter because the Constitution set such a higher threshold. So, these are things that I think, unless you have a kind of non-romanticized, non-hagiographic kind of understanding of the founding, you've really got to kind of come to terms with. And I think that deluding ourselves about the character of the thing and the reasons why they brought themselves there to Philadelphia in 1787 are going to prevent us from making the change that we need. So it's time to start telling ourselves a different story here.
Yeah, I mean, 2 things jump out when you look at the real story, right? One is that far from being like this sort of perfect, Noctian or from God system, it was the product of a lot of compromise and people being like, fuck, we need Rhode Island to say yes to this.
Yeah, Rogue Island, as they call it.
Yeah. And so much of it is just moving forward. But the other is that there is so much dynamism behind it, right? That there are all of these different warring ideas.
Right.
And through that, too, you get, 150 years of movement, right? Like there is a lot of Supreme Court reform until 1869, right?
Mhm.
There is Senate reform until 1911. You still have new states until the 1950s. And I think that, the idea that everything that we have is set in stone and that we're stuck with it is a relatively contemporary idea. But that kind of stasis, I think, is a real important and defining part of the political character of this country right now.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think? Sometimes I'm just like, oh, there's so much stasis, when it comes to adding states, because like 50 is a nice number, right? But there's obviously something else going on as well too in terms of reform, because there hasn't been a lot of this. A lot of the political reform that you're advocating for in this book has not been happening recently, although there's a long history of it.
There is, and I only cover historically the founding in this book, but there's a great book by Aziz Rana called The Constitutional Bind that recently came out that goes through the history of constitutional veneration, the place a constitution becomes to occupy in American culture, and also the different kinds of reform efforts we've seen through time. But yeah, for most of American history, people have found it okay to say we should change this thing.
Yeah.
Obviously the founders from the get-go tried to imbue it with a certain sense of import, and they talk about, God delivering the document in particular ways and so on. But, they also said, well, there's an amendment process we hope works, and people are going to change this. And I don't think that we're going to be as smart or as wise as people coming down the pike. And we've totally lost any of that. That's completely out the window. And I think even for people who understand some of the problems I'm talking about, there's still this real hesitancy about wanting to make or saying that you want to make a full break. You go to these No Kings protests, or you go to any kind of gathering where people are, I think, rightfully angry about Donald Trump, and they'll with all the earnestness in their heart say things like, well, I swore an oath as a member of the military or as a civil servant to defend the Constitution, and here are the 15 ways Donald Trump is violating the Constitution. And I just think that we're at a point where if we want things to actually change, if we want to prevent the rise of another Donald Trump and also address the kind of lurch, right, we're making as a country for anti-democratic reasons, we need to break from that mentality and start telling ourselves that we're offended most by the ways in which Donald Trump or whoever is abrogating our basic rights as human beings to democratic governance, which is a different register to speak in. But I kind of forgive people for doing this, because I think that there has been a real record of success in utilizing the Constitution or the kind of imagination about the Constitution to drive progress forward. Frederick Douglass being, a classic example of this. And I get that, and I don't discount that history, but I do think we're kind of at this crossroads where we've gone as far as we can go with the process of amending this Constitution. There are people out there who say that we might never amend it again, given political realities. And it's I don't know what else would tell us that it's time for a break than a guy who came into the Electoral College trying to mount a coup to stay in office. Again, it's just, I don't know what it's going to take. But I also hope that, part of what I'm saying here too is beyond the structural reasons why I think this needs to happen, beyond the institutional reforms I think substantively are justified, that there is something about the promise of American democracy and the idea of fulfilling the promise of American democracy that can be galvanizing. One of the reasons why we lost this last election is because I think people perceive Democrats as being defenders of institutions that they no longer believed in. Like 70-something% of the American public, according to a Gallup poll earlier last year, thought that American democracy was not working. To go into an election in that reality and talk about defending democracy, I think is kind of suicidal. You need to speak to the distrust, the dissatisfaction that people have. And if you're going to talk about democracy, you need to talk about democracy in a way that feels to those people like it's not just propping up what exists, but moving us towards a future that we can construct together. It's called the case for New American Founding because I think that we have the right and the ability to consider ourselves as founders. We're not just dusting off what exists now with a feather duster and hoping it stays up. We have the power, capacity, the right to establish a new country based on our values, not the values that obtained more than 2 centuries ago. That to me sounds like a more compelling political message than let's just do whatever and return to, people making deals at the Senate cafeteria or whatever. I don't know. For me, it just sounds better. And I think it also brings us into a lot of economic issues that I think I'll talk about at the end of the book.
Yeah, it's where I wanted to go now. I mean, I think that one of the things I was thinking about while reading it was that the pro-democracy argument that we saw in the last election was, I think there were times where it felt like it was inadvertently pro-autocracy, right? Because what it ended up saying was they said, look, this guy over here, he's different, right? He's not like our institutions, which we need to protect. And people are, well, these institutions are terrible, right? Like they're all bad and they're not working for us. And I think that one of the failures of even the best pro-democracy stuff is it doesn't address economic issues at all. And I think that where this book, I think, becomes truly radical and provocative is in its last chapter, which is about the idea of a kind of economic constitutional reform or sort of larger economic political reforms. And this idea that without those, the political or democratic reforms themselves will not work. And it felt to me for the first time like a true kind of like post-Bernie intellectual step had been taken, which I thought was very powerful and interesting. But I was wondering first how you sort of came to that, and then how you started to sort of formulate the connection between the sort of political or the democratic and the sort of economic ideas.
Yeah, I mean, post 2016, when I began sort of engaging with and writing about the left more seriously, I'd go to these gatherings and I read all these books, and implicitly, it seemed like one of the fundamental ideals motivating people's interest in whether it was unions or whatever, formulations of worker power, was a kind of democratic intuition. And I actually felt like that was not foregrounded very often in a lot of left politics. I support Medicare for all. I support expanding the welfare state and all of these kinds of ways that we've talked about for so often. But it felt like the basic democratic issue of who controls the economy and who has the right to make decisions in the economy was not at the center of a lot of what I was hearing. And for me, that was one of the most compelling ideas around. We spend about a third of our lives at work. The decisions that are made at work often affect us more directly, immediately, and intimately than decisions made in Washington, D.C., or our state capitals, or in City Hall. And yet we take it for granted that we're not entitled to any kind of democratic say at work at all. Why is that? Why is it the case that somebody who works at Amazon, and I think this should be the case, can go to the polls every 2 to 4 years and vote about our foreign policy with respect to Iran? But there's no place in their life where they can say how Amazon should be run, except through a political system that Amazon pays to dominate. That's a basic democratic question. In fact, if you read some of these dry and dusty political theory books about democracy, it was very funny to me to begin reading these books, have all of this incredible stuff about political institutions, and in the very best of them, you come towards the end, and they'd be like, I guess we might be entitled to democracy in the economy too.
Yeah.
And then that's it. It's just like in closing notes. Robert Dahl isn't the exception. So Robert Dahl, very famous political theorist, democratic theorist, very well respected, put out a monograph in the 80s called A Preface to Economic Democracy, where he delves into a lot of these issues. But it has not really been a live concern for most of the people who study this academically. I think that's starting to change. If you read people like Elizabeth Anderson, for instance, philosopher at University of Michigan, wrote this great book called Private Government. I'm sure you could pick up somewhere around here, that delves into autocracy at work and the extent to which workplaces are authoritarian in ways that, again, we take for granted. But yeah, it just struck me as I began reading for this book, you could not cleave these two worlds apart, that there was obviously more connecting the realm of politics and the realm of the economy than Citizens United, as important as Citizens United is. Beyond campaign finance reform, beyond lobbying, the extent to which the economy is dominated by certain people, a small class of people, obviously has implications for how politics functions in general, even when people aren't writing checks to their favorite politicians. And that just seemed obvious to me. I mean, I wrote when I was in the New Yorker briefly about the Amazon HQ2 search, right, where you had this parade of cities around the country offering, behind closed doors, all kinds of incentives, packages, and tax breaks, and so on, to get Amazon to come in without public discussion, without public deliberation, just because they dangled this promise of a headquarters being out there. There's nothing illegal about it per se. They didn't pay these people off, but the power Amazon wields as a corporation was such that they could influence a public policy process in this kind of way. Another thing I talk about in the book is, those of us as journalists have this responsibility, I think, to convey an accurate sense of what the economy is actually doing to people and how it's actually working for actual people. But most of the metrics people read about when they read the news to figure out how the economy is working are, did the stock market go up or down today? What were corporate earnings like? These are just kind of the available metrics that we have. And because those are easily accessible, there's a study that was done, I think, a couple of years ago that talks about how public sentiment that the economy is driven more by those things than any kind of real connected understanding of the economy as it relates to ordinary people. I mean, I think, the top 10% of Americans control like 93% of the stocks in the country. And so, there's a level of, I think, real economic influence in all kinds of insidious ways that don't translate neatly to things you could legislate away. You have to really kind of deal with the fundamental underlying structure of the economy to get at them. I think the ancients understood this in funny ways more than we do today. But yeah, we're going to have our first trillionaires very, very soon. And if you think that we can sustain the promise of democracy under those conditions, I think you're kind of delusional. I think we're obviously moving towards a society in which people, a very small class of people, holds much, much more power than entire states or entire levels of government. And I could not have constructed a caricature of why this is true, more apt than Elon Musk and what happened over the first months of this year.
Well, so I was going to ask about the pro act, but instead I'm going to ask about something that is maybe sillier, but I want to, and I have the mic. But speaking of Elon Musk, right? One of the other powers that Elon Musk wields is not just economic power; it's cultural power as well. And I think that we like to laugh at him because he's an idiot and he's very bad at doing it. But he's still, I think, part of an ascendant right-wing cultural movement, and one that I think gets laughed off a lot by the left in ways that are sometimes fair. But I was thinking, during the election, the closing weeks, right? You had these sort of endless quasi controversies that have, in some cases, continued about, like, the Harris campaign bringing in Beyonce or Oprah or these sort of megastars, right? And Trump, meanwhile, did this event at Madison Square Garden, which I think even I said was going to kill his campaign, with the guy from Kill Tony, and he's appearing with the Nelk boys, these doofuses. And yet, I think, one of the things that you did see from this was a form of populist culture, right? That was sort of rallying behind the president, and is still a more kind of establishment side on the Democratic side. And I was wondering if you think that there is a kind of cultural component to what you're talking about here as well, that when you're making these sort of pro-democratic arguments, these sort of arguments about democratizing the economy as well, that there needs to be a component that also connects in a way to real people, right? Though in the way that they're experiencing their everyday lives, that's not from on high. That when you're trying to reach regular people, it's not just from a mega star. It's from somebody that they can relate to as a normal person.
Yeah. So I think my answer is going to be even more long-winded and winding than all of my previous ones so far. And a lot of it's not in the book. It's just stuff I'm thinking about now as I start writing other things. This is a moment, I think, where we have the opportunity now to just go back to first principles and think about what our politics are fundamentally about. I offer some very practical reasons in this book why I think democracy is desirable as a system, but there's also a basic intuition that each and every one of us is entitled to some measure of control of the conditions that shape our lives. In the brief time that we have on this rock, it is wrong for us to live that under the thumb of some person who happens to be wealthier than us at the outset or more powerful in some way. We should have the power to live the lives that we want to live in all the ways that we can. And so that, I think, is why we deserve the right to vote in political democracy. That's why I think we also deserve a voice and rights at work. I also think that's why a woman deserves the right to choose. I think that's why people shouldn't go into medical debt or die because they can't afford healthcare. I think that's why we should stop or arrest the progress of climate change, so we're not, thrown into immiseration by this kind of arbitrary thing. We deserve agency, and we deserve agency because a human being is special. There's something fundamental and important about each and every one of us, and that sounds very, very trite to say, but we're in a moment now where the human being is being framed as an outmoded technology. I was on Ross Douthat's show a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't get a chance to ask him what the whole thing with Peter Thiel was about. But if you missed it, Peter Thiel goes on Ross's show and he starts talking about transcending kind of our mortal bodies and becoming more than human or beyond human. And Ross asks him, "What do you mean? Like, are you saying that you are supporting the kind of elision or the end of the human being?" And Thiel kinds of waffles on this point. I quite like the human being, and I'd like to defend it. And I think that should be a core aspect of our politics on the left moving forward. I think that you have all kinds of people who are either rejecting humanity in important ways. So the right is right now telling us that whole swaths of the globe are lesser than we are, that there's nothing intrinsically important about being a human being as such, that some human beings are more important than others. You have people who are trying to sell out the human being to bolster profits because they think that AI can do some of the things that we do now better, and even though it obviously can't. So who's left defending the human as such? We are, I hope. And I think that means connecting with people on a level beyond, highfalutin politics. I think that means, too, connecting with people at the level of saying that you should join us and you should be on the left because we are going to protect and preserve the things that make life worth living, too. We're going to have a culture that is not inundated by slop. We're going to have a culture where real artists, human beings, write and paint and sculpt and do all the things that we've done for thousands of years. We're going to keep that going. We're not going to give that over to Google to replace. That seems like it's a message worth offering to people. We want to give you the resources to, not just spend all of your money on rent or on your basic necessities, but to have enough that you can actually go out and do things that you're going to enjoy, whether that's going to a concert, investing in menswear. Very, very important. There's a level at which I feel like we're not connecting with people in that sense. I think that people feel that the left is very dour and very depressing and very kind of strident about certain things, but there's not, I think, enough of a feeling of joy, especially given that I think that our politics enables people, gives people more of the resources to experience it than any other form of politics you might consider as an alternative. And we should be saying that, we should be doing that. And I think that there's something democratic about that too. So I do talk a little bit about Walt Whitman in this. And only a little bit because I could go on rambling about it forever. And I've already rambled enough. But the last thing I'll say here is that I also watched this speech that Eric Schmidt, this senator, gave at NatCon maybe like yesterday.
It was yesterday.
This is just your standard blood and soil stuff now being spouted by
It's like
a U.S.
crazy.
senator, talking about how we have this European heritage that we need to maintain and preserve, and that's what's going to keep us afloat as a country, and that's where great things come from. Um, and it's very trite to say that this is un-American. It is, but I feel like people don't understand how fundamentally un-American it is. Like prior to even the kind of 20th century, we're a nation of immigrant stuff. One of the fundamental ideas shaping the culture of the early republic is that we are not European. That European society was dominated by aristocracy, that it was encrusted in all these kinds of ways with old traditions that we were shedding here. And we had the power to shed here for, frankly, reasons that were imperialist and not good. And that's the bad aspect of alt women we could get into. But there's a prevailing sense that American society would prove the snobs wrong by demonstrating that equality and democratic values could produce great and extraordinary things. And that all would have a hand in doing that, no matter who you happen to be. And the bounds of that who expanded with time. And I think for a while we did prove people wrong. I think that this country's last 150 years are some of the most extraordinary that any society in human history has ever had, culturally, in terms of what we were able to invent, we were able to do, innovate, music, art, writing. And we now have a kind of technology in AI in the sector that's premised upon the idea that all of that is behind us. We can just kind of mine the past and remix it and turn it into a meat grinder and slob it out. And that's all that's left to do. And I don't believe that. And I think that resisting that is a kind of democratic politics.
That's great. So we have time for a couple questions, if anyone up front.
What do you think of exchanging a guaranteed minimum income for coming to the polls? If you vote, you get the money. If you don't, you don't.
Well, so just briefly, just the question for people that are listening is if how he feels about exchanging a guaranteed minimum income in exchange for democratic participation in the form of voting.
Well, I mean, I think that we should consider a general minimum income for everybody, irrespective of whether or not they vote. But I do think that there are systems that people have considered that would induce people to come to the polls more. I mean, people talk a lot. People have emailed me a lot about mandatory voting, which they have in Australia and other places. It's worth looking at. I mean, I think that those things are worth considering once you've already made it easy for people to vote, and we haven't. We don't have automatic voter registration or mandatory voter registration. And so if we were to impose a system in which people face penalties for not voting, who would face those penalties? Probably disproportionately poor minority people. Once you make access to the vote easier, then you can consider things like mandatory voting. But also, people have talked about giving people some kind of income, partially for democratic reasons. As I talk about in the book, it's very, very hard for you to think about politics actively if you're not sure how you can pay the rent next month, or you're not sure how you're going to afford childcare. These are people's immediate concerns, and as long as they're doing that, they're not reading the New Republic. And so we've got to get them in a place financially where we can subscribe to magazines like ours,
yes,
and participate in politics on that level. But people like Philip Pettit, for instance, who I talk about in the book, have said that part of the reason why you need to give people some kind of minimum income is so that they can participate more fully as democratic citizens without as many distractions, with more power and more agency. And I think there's something really to that.
David?
Yeah, I feel like I'm probably an easy sell on many of the ways you would want to democratize America and scrap our undemocratic and pro-oligarchic institutions. Maybe you address this in the book. I'm constantly find myself wondering now, what is the actual, do you have like a blueprint in your head for how we might get to the position where we could refound the country? Like what, does that entail a civil war or a general collapse of the economy, or what is the process? I mean, like you said, the revolution came out of a bloody war. The Civil War was a bloody war that cut half the states out of the process, and then we could amend the Constitution without them, and then force them to accept that on coming back in, which they kicked and screamed about for another 100 years. So like what what do we do to overcome the fact that the Senate is structurally undemocratic, or the Electoral College, or the right-wing Supreme Court? Like, how, what kind of paths do you envision to getting to a point where we could begin to fix all that?
The questions are
How do we do
the
this?
preconditions.
Easy,
Yeah.
easy,
Yeah.
simple
Uh,
to address.
Yeah, no, I mean, so the most important question, perhaps. What I'm talking about establishing here is a long-term movement, setting us on a path of like long-term struggle, like the civil rights movement or the women's movement. This is not something that I think you could do in the next election cycle. I do not support having a constitutional convention, in the next couple of years. People emailed me about this too a lot. That one, for the practical reason that the people who've really invested in making that happen have been people on the right. The Koch brothers have funded a constitutional convention project for years now. And so if we were to find ourselves in that position soon, I think we'd be kind of outfoxed and out-resourced, and we would not come away with a more democratic constitution. So I'm really advocating for here is a kind of long-term struggle, which I think that there are short and medium-term things we can do. You had a democratic reform package early in the Biden administration that I thought was pretty good. I think DC statehood should have been a part of that, and other things should have been a part of that. You could resurrect that whole legislative effort in another Democratic administration very soon, depending on whether Democrats decide they want to win elections again. Not clear. But that seems like things that are within the realm of plausibility within the next 10 to 15 years. One of the things you never hear about is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So there are basically two ways people have figured out that you can get rid of the Electoral College. One is a constitutional amendment, probably not happening. The other way is through an interstate compact where states decide on their own that they're going to give their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. And with states with a total of 270 electoral votes, the number you need to win, have done this. You functionally worked around the Electoral College. We are now at 209, I think, 200 something electoral votes in this compact. The states that have done it are all, as you might imagine, pretty blue states, and so it's harder lift in the next few, but that's plausible. I mean, there'd inevitably be some kind of court challenge. But this is something that we could do and try. If this is the first you're hearing about it, I think that, again, the Democratic Party needs to decide whether it's going to be a party or not. There's only so much I can do. But there are things that we can do in the near term. Projects like getting rid of the Senate in the long term, obviously that's going to require larger change. I do not think a civil war. I do not think a kind of grand upheaval, or at least I hope not. But I would be very, very small. I'm not going to live to the end of the century, but if I were able to, I would be surprised if we made it to 2100 with the legislature we have. It does not seem like something that we should expect to sustain itself for very, very long. If people have the awareness that it's creating problems, it does. If it continues to have these kind of unequal outcomes and it bars us from legislating, I think that we could see that and some kind of large constitutional change in the next couple of decades. But it'll take time. It'll take building up democracy where we can, including at the state and local level. It's easier to amend state constitutions, obviously, than the federal constitution. These can be places where we do kind of proof of concept for certain democratic reforms. But the other part of this, too, is I really, really think that the economic piece of this is going to be key to making the large-scale political changes happen. We have the Constitution that we have because the people who were in the room in 1787 were some of the wealthiest, most educated people in the country. They had a particular interest. There was no voice in that room in Philadelphia from the farmers who had, agitated so much on behalf of debt relief. If we come to another constitutional moment, we need to be sure that the people who walk out of that room know that they have to enact democratic changes, or else there's going to be some kind of economic consequence. And the only lever that I can think of that would work in that way is labor power. The knowledge that workers have the right to strike, have the ability to strike in large numbers, I think should shape whatever constitutional project or moment we arrive at, whenever that happens. And that's not going to be at 6% private sector union density, which is where we're at now. We need much, much stronger labor unions and much stronger institutions of labor power to really force the changes that I think we want. So that's another one of the reasons why I think this is going to take a long time.
I would wager that a lot of people blame issues with democracy on the political parties, and we've seen some pretty embarrassing attempts to break the two-party system in recent history. I'm sure everyone's running out to vote the Forward Party or the America Party. Did you find any theory that you would lend credence to in terms of changing the political parties or the party system in a way that would be beneficial for American democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I was ambivalent about party stuff for such a long time because you did see all of these idiotic, like, third-party things prop up. You know, people talk about it in the New York Times op-ed section all the time. You know, what if we had a centrist party? Well, we do. So I've always been kind of ambivalent about it, but I do think that there is something democratic about having more than two choices, you know, potentially. So there's a reform I talk about in the reform chapter. And it's basically moving to a system of proportional representation with multi-member districts. So instead of electing one person per congressional district, move to a system where each district gets, you know, a lot of seats or a number of seats proportional with their population. And then the parties are awarded seats within each district based on the proportion of the vote that they win. So you win 60% of the vote in a district, you win 60% of the seats. And that party sends people to Washington, but also the other people send people to Washington as well. And that actually opens up the door, political scientists have said, to having third parties, other parties emerge. You probably see a left party emerge out of this. On the other side, you probably see an even more racist party.
Yeah.
So, you know, if people who like the idea of multi-party democracy, that is the easiest way to do it. There's legislation called the Fair Representation Act that Don Baer of Virginia has been offering since, I believe, 2017 that would do this. You don't need a constitutional amendment, although I am quite certain this would end up in court, as everything would, which is why we should pack the court. But yeah, there are reforms we can make that would open up the party system considerably. And I think one of the advantages of that too is we have such a distorted idea of what the country looks like politically. We go to the polls every election day and we come back home and we see these like big blocky maps, and this is where all the liberals live and this is where all the conservatives live. And our entire understanding of the country is built upon that. And if one of the people who worries about tribalism, you worry about misinformation, you worry about division, that's not good. You know, you would hope that we'd have an understanding at least of our own political reality and where people actually are located. So I think it's important for people to know that there are more people who voted for Donald Trump in this city in 2016, in 2020, and 2024 than there are in both the Dakotas combined. We do not have a political discourse that reflects that fact. People, I don't think, generally know that or aware of that, do not act like they know that. But it matters, and it should shape our understanding of what the city is. Conversely, there are hundreds of thousands of people in the Dakotas who voted for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. We don't talk about that. So, you know, if we had a multi-party system where you had all parts of the country sending people from all sides of the spectrum to Washington, I think it would open up discourse a lot. The different kinds of politicians emerge from different parts of the country wouldn't necessarily expect, and you know, maybe that'd be to their good.
Okay, for one more, maybe actually yellow. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about where civil rights protections would come into in your vision for democracy, both like where they would derive from on a philosophical level, but then also on a practical level? Like,
Yeah.
Would they look similar to what we have today, or do you have a different?
It's an extremely good question, and
You want to repeat it?
yes, sure. Sorry. So, where does civil rights sit in this conversation? What's my conception of civil rights and how it relates to democracy? I think the hardest part of this book to write was the part about the judiciary, given that it is truly messed up in ways that are internationally very unusual. Having lifetime appointments to the bench, insane. People don't do this elsewhere in the world. It's American exceptions, I guess. At the same time, I do think that having a judiciary perform some of the functions that we have our judiciary perform, judicial review, is important, partially because I think it could help us protect civil rights. Most countries, you know, judicial review is actually not that unusual. It's one of the things that we do that's not that weird. But I think that there's a role for it, potentially. Very controversial opinion. Sam Moyne, who was generous enough to blurb this book, I think really, really smart, has a completely different take on the judiciary and the role it plays in society, the role it ought to play. And I think that's an important debate to have. But one of the things that I thought was useful as an intervention in the debate is an idea I kind of borrowed from this theorist called named Corey Brettschneider. And he has this book called Democratic Rights, where he talks about some of the rights that we understand as liberal rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., can also be understood as democratic rights. They're not things that we have to import from outside of democracy, but they're actually implied by democratic principles. And so when we have this situation where, you'd want maybe a court to strike down a law disenfranchising a minority, right? It's troubled people for a long time that seems to place liberalism above democracy in a certain way. What Brettschneider says is actually that's completely consistent with democracy. There's not this conceptual tension. As a practical matter, the same thing happens, but I think there's something important about recognizing the extent to which those rights are actually integral to democracy, partially to defend democracy, because I think that the liberal democratic conception where these things are separate undermines people's faith in democracy as a worthwhile system. You run into these examples where it's like, well, what if you enslave everybody by casting majority vote? And we should prevent that. But I think that being able to say preventing that is not inconsistent with democracy, it's actually integral to making democracy work, is an important conception for people to have of that issue. So if that answers your question, I feel like it gets at some of what you were. Yeah.
I think that is what we have time for, but Osita will be signing books in the back, I believe. And, in the front? I'm sorry. I don't listen. But thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy this wonderful book.
Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to all of you who asked questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone, but maybe your questions will be answered if you read this book. So if you haven't gotten a copy
Also,
yet,
maybe not.
maybe you'll think of more, in which case, email Osita. But we've got plenty of additional copies available at the front where you checked in. And again, we have free copies of the New York Review of Books latest issue, which features Osita inside, so please check that out as well. Osita will be around to sign and personalize your books. That's going to be happening where my coworkers are pointing to. Yeah, right over there. It'll make a little bit more sense in a minute. We're just going to ask that you please hold your hellos and congratulations until you get to Osita in line. We're going to get him set up back there, and then please make sure to grab all of your personal belongings with you. Line up down the center aisle and curve around to the wall. We will be coming around to get all of these chairs out of the way. So please be mindful of our booksellers as well. That's all we have tonight. Let's give these two one last round of applause.
That was great.